So this event is in collaboration with UWX and UW Blueprint, and we're super excited to have some university alumni and current students with us to share about ways to effectively collaborate with product managers, designers, and other designers and engineers in a workspace or a project team. So firstly, we would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that the Waterloo, Kitchener, and Cambridge campuses of the University of Waterloo are situated on the Haldimand Tract, land that was granted to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River and are within the territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. And we're very fortunate and grateful to be able to do what we do. So firstly, some introductions. We are UWX, and our goal is to grow the design community and empower designers to support, inspire each other through the community engagements. And we have some socials down here. Vanessa will be sending links as we go throughout this presentation today.
And I will be representing UW Blueprint. And if you don't know what UW Blueprint is, we are a student-run organization that is dedicated to building and promoting technology for social good. And how we do that is by partnering with nonprofits and social enterprises to define and develop software solutions to tackle their most difficult issues so that they can focus on doing what they do without being blocked by logistical issues. And, hopefully with our technology, they're able to grow and scale and make more social impact by, being a nonprofit. We will also be dropping the socials in the chat. Carmen, do we have a slide for recruitment, or am I just talking about that now?
We have one at the end.
Just kidding. Stay tuned for more information about joining Blueprint. All right, so for the agenda, what we'll be doing today is we're only here for an hour. So we'll hopefully get through all this crazy, amazing educational content within that time. We'll be kicking it off with Carly, and she'll be talking about how to be a great cross-functional collaborator to designers and to PMs and to engineers from a design perspective. We will also, actually, no, not engineers, because that's Brandon's section, and he'll be talking specifically about working with engineers who are also one of your closest partners. And then we will have Jenna, who is the VP product at UW Blueprint this term, and she'll be talking from a product manager's perspective about how she works with designers and how that relationship looks like to her as a product manager. And then we'll have Jack, who is a developer, and he'll be talking about how, as an engineer, how he likes to work with designers. And then at the end, we'll have a general Q&A, but it's more like a discussion. So if other people here in the chat have experience working in cross-functional teams, we'd love to hear from your experiences and your opinions as well. So we'll just have 10 minutes to kind of ask any questions or just talk about all of our cross-functional stories.
Awesome. Hello, I'm Carly. Yes, next slide. So I'm currently the founding product designer at a startup called Explo. We do dashboards as a service. So I like to think of it as B2B SaaS for B2B SaaS. Yeah, we're a pretty small team. There's 10 of us right now, and currently I'm the only designer. So a lot of my workday is spent collaborating with people who are not designers. Yeah, I guess some other things about me. I'm a Libra Scorpio cusp. And then if you like other personality stuff, check that out. Yeah, next. Thanks, Carmen. So why are cross-functional relationships important? Well, first off, building a product is super complicated. It's complicated on the design side, but also there's so many different moving parts. And I think another really important thing to keep in mind as a designer is that the success of your work is contingent on other people's implementation of it. So that means it really benefits you to have a strong relationship with the people you work with because you rely on them for your work to be successful. Awesome. So I like to think about cross-functional relationships in two parts. There's the functional needs of the relationship. So needing to understand the project you're on, to know what's expected of your role, knowing who to ask for help. And then there's also the relational needs. So that's your need to feel understood and to feel valued and to feel heard. And everyone on your team has those needs. And I think a really important part of approaching cross-functional relationships is making sure that you're balancing those two things. Cool. So relational communication is pretty key. It's also kind of like the foundation for how things can happen. It's a lot easier to have effective functional communication with someone that you already have an existing strong relationship with. As like people who go about things in the world, we are like biased by those relationships. So if you have a really strong relationship with someone you work with, you're more likely to be influenced by their ideas or opinions, and to be more open to the things they might propose. And so that means that it's like really beneficial to build those relationships because it's setting yourself up to be more successful with those future projects. Awesome. So what does effective functional communication look like? Well, there are 3 things you can do. Oh, sorry, relational communication. Effective relational communication consists of 3 things: alignment, curiosity, and appreciation. So alignment can look like asking someone what's important to them, sharing what's important to you, being very like open about your priorities when it comes to a project, but also in your workday. This is like super helpful, especially if there's someone that maybe you're finding it hard to build a relationship with. I remember there was one dev that I worked with at an internship, and he had really bad experiences collaborating with designers in the past. And so that first conversation, I was really focused on like, what do we have in common? And like, what are things that he cares about that I care about that we can kind of like align on? And we had some like really great conversations. He shared that he was really interested in like really, really clean, high quality code. And like through that, I got to ask a lot more questions like, oh, what does that look like? Why is that important to you? And I got to learn so much more about like what was exciting for him in his work. And it made it a lot easier to share what was exciting for me in my work and see kind of like how we had similarities there. And that's like very energizing to work from as a baseline. Curiosity, I guess, oops, same slide. Thanks, Carmen. Curiosity is very similar to that. I think that's maybe more what I was just describing. But there's kind of one thing where it's like making sure you're on the same page and then also showing that you like are interested in the other person and what they're interested in. Appreciation is very simple. It's like as small as just saying like, oh, thank you for adding feedback to this feedback you added to my work, or like, thank you for the contribution you made in that meeting. Or like, thanks for taking the time to meet with me for this one-on-one. Those little pieces of appreciation can go a really long way in showing people that you're noticing the efforts that they're putting into your work together and just like the team environment in general. Awesome. Next slide. Cool. So effective functional communication. What can that look like with PMs? Well, something that's really important is considering what the PM's goal is in the broader team. An important thing to do at the beginning of projects when you're collaborating with a PM is to clarify what the goals are. So it's helpful to check in with them if there are important business goals or KPIs that they're tracking for the project, and make sure that you're really aligned on what you want the outcome to be and how you're going to measure your success. Secondly, it's good to keep them in the loop with your work. So if you know, oh, I'm probably going to have my low fidelity prototype ready by this date, you can kind of share that out and share important milestones along the way. And that also ensures that they know what's coming and there's no big surprises. If there's big gaps in your work, it's easy for people to like lose touch with the things that are guiding your decisions. Lastly, it's helpful to solicit their opinions. So they have a really good sense of what the roadmap is, how our product might need to scale. And so it's good to kind of touch base and make sure that the decisions you're making for a given project are going to make sense in 6 months or even a year's time as the product evolves. Next slide. Awesome. Yeah, and then there's also the people you collaborate on the design team with. So that could be other designers, that could be content strategists, content marketers, UX researchers. When collaborating with people on the design team, it's helpful to think about them as a wealth of knowledge, especially if you're interning. A lot of people have probably been there for a really long time, so it's great to leverage that when you're starting a new project. That could mean asking them about past research that's been done in that area. It could also mean just like asking where you can find more context on a given problem and like make use of the work that's already been done. It's also helpful to keep in sync and be really mindful of other people's schedules and priorities. So if you're working with a content strategist and you want their feedback on how to frame a new feature in the product, it would be good to give them a heads up, like at least a week or two in advance. Oh, just so you know, I'm working on this new concept and this new feature. It would be really great to get your feedback on it and get a good sense of like how we might want to communicate this so that they can anticipate that work and plan for it. Yeah, and then soliciting opinions within the design team can look a little bit different. That can look like asking for very specific feedback. It can also look like asking for like feedback on different milestones along the way. And just making sure that you're doing your design work at the highest quality that you can be doing it. Awesome. Next slide. Cool. I like to use one-on-one meetings as a great tool for practicing some of these things. I like to make, like, sometimes, especially first one-on-ones, I like to make secret agendas, like just my own agenda. And that usually includes like a functional goal for the meeting and a relational goal. So let's say you're meeting someone on the team for the first time. Maybe a functional goal for that meeting could be to better understand like how their work might like come together with your project. But then a relational goal might be to say like, oh, I want to know more about this hobby that they shared in this meeting, or I want to know more about what's important to this person. And then you can kind of see if you're asking the right questions to get you to that goal by the end of your meeting. Yeah. Also, it's easier. I think it's hard to get into the habit of feeling comfortable asking some of these like more direct relational questions, especially if you're interning and you just joined the team and there's so many of these one-on-one meetings you might be having. So I think it helps a lot to like make a plan and write down a couple you might try during the meeting ahead of time so that when you're in that meeting, you have a couple things in your back pocket, just because it's hard to think about that on the spot. Awesome. So quick recap, when you're thinking about collaborating with people, think about the functional needs and the relational needs. For relational communication, you want to try to understand their motivations and share your motivations. You want to be curious about what's important to them, and you want to show appreciation for their work. When collaborating with PMs, you want to clarify business goals, you want to update them along the way, and you want to solicit their opinions. And when working with other people in a design team, you want to build context and leverage the team's knowledge. You want to keep everybody in sync. And then you also want to solicit opinions with them as well. And it's easiest to do these things when you plan for them. Cool. That is all.
Nice.
I'll pass it to Brandon.
I think something came up and Brandon actually can't make it. So I'm just going to skip through these slides and then Jenna can take over for her part.
Yes. Okay. Happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be here today and share some of my thoughts on PM and designer collaboration. Next slide, please. So as a brief intro, I'm Jenna. I'm heading into my 3B term of management engineering in the fall. I'm currently the VP product and a PM at UW Blueprint, which I love. And I'm also a product manager intern at theScore. In my day-to-day, I work with a couple of like product designers really, really closely, which I'm really enjoying so far. Next slide. So you might be wondering what to expect as a designer that might work with a PM in an internship. To answer that question, let's first address what the heck a product manager even is. So the role of a PM breaks down to guiding the development of products, setting goals and success metrics, balancing business objectives with technology and user experience, and addressing the why of why you're building something. Sometimes the what in conjunction with designers, never really the how. Next slide. Let's also talk a little bit about how design fits into the overall software development process. Depending on the maturity stage of the product that you're working on, as well as the company and the team you're on, this will look different. However, there are different processes and methodologies that teams follow that might give you a better idea of what your internship or co-op experience might look like. So the first one I'll introduce you to is called the waterfall methodology. It's pretty common, so if you've heard of it before, that's great. If not, no worries. It's a process where projects and products are split into steps, and those chunks are worked on one step after another. All the design is typically created ahead of development for different projects. So the process is referred to by the phrase big design upfront, or BDUF. The waterfall process is not very adaptable to changing requirements and is thus inflexible. Next slide, please. Agile is an iterative approach to managing projects and software development, and it focuses on delivering value at every step of the way. So like you can see on this image here, the top option focuses on building the car in a very waterfall way. None of the steps prior to 4 give you any value. However, in the bottom section, you can see that the user has value in each different phase, but the level of effectiveness is, or like the level of usability is different in each one and improves as you go along. So like the name suggests, agile, this approach makes teams and projects more flexible. Next slide. So Scrum is an agile methodology that is rooted in prioritized incremental work that is done in sprints, which are fixed time box periods, typically around 2 weeks, sometimes 1, sometimes more than 2. A typical confusion is the difference between Scrum and Agile. So Agile is the philosophy with values and principles associated with it, and then Scrum is a specific Agile methodology with prescribed practices. So Scrum itself has some specific ceremonies associated with it. Don't get scared by the abundance of words on the slide there, but there are some planning ceremonies, daily stand-up, a review, retrospectives, things like that. The way designers work within an organization that uses Scrum is that design work is chunked into sprints as well, and the designers typically work a sprint ahead of developers. So we don't have too much time today to go into more of the software development methodologies, but if you're interested in this topic, I would definitely recommend finding some really cool Medium articles. They definitely exist. There are a bunch of them. So you can look into both of these methodologies and a bunch more that exist, including Kanban, Lean, there's a bunch more. Next slide, please. So now that we've covered some context, we can quickly talk about some sources of friction between designers and PMs. One that can occur is stepping on each other's toes or duplication of work that can occur at the crux because of unclear responsibilities. There's a bunch of aspects between the two roles that can overlap. And on top of that, there's a lack of uniformity in the way that a product manager's role is structured. Again, depending on the type of team you're on or the company or even the industry, it can really vary. So it causes a lot of confusion there. PMs, unfortunately, may also sometimes approach you with a solution rather than a well-defined problem. Another frustration that might occur is what might happen if there's an awesome thing that's been designed, but a halfway or MVP state might get released because of potentially constrained resources. Sometimes there might be attachment to the idea on the design and sometimes product end, but in some cases it's better to get something released and iterate upon that as long as the future state is not forgotten. Generally, there are definitely situations where miscommunication and unmet expectations can happen. Next slide. So now's the time where I jump in with my 2 cents on some actionable ways to improve collaboration with the PM. Overall, my suggestion is communication and honesty. Get to know each other, make explicit the things that you normally may not vocalize or may otherwise assume. Some questions that you might want to cover regarding ways of working include your expectations of each other, frequency of check-ins and how you do them, feedback giving and receiving preferences, and especially one thing that I found is super valuable is communicating the best way that you'd like the PM to share ideas that they have. So like I addressed, sometimes they may come at you with a solution, but if you clearly define your expectations of how you want them to present ideas they have and their intention, it can be a lot more successful in terms of the collaboration. You can also work towards achieving alignment, which is something that Carly articulated super well. Alignment regarding ownership can be super helpful. Come together, decide what is co-owned or individually owned by each stakeholder and what co-ownership might look like. In my internship right now, we have a breakdown of typically which groups are responsible for what, so who's accountable versus responsible versus consulted. And that serves as a general guideline, but each PM, designer, pair can figure out what works for them. Next slide, please. So when you're working on a specific project or initiative, it can be really helpful to maintain a strong understanding of a few things, some of which Carly already touched on, including relevant goals and KPIs and addressing dependencies. Some other things are timeline and deadlines, which is super important. So how much time do we have for a specific project? What should the milestones look like? Scope and constraints. Is this project, are you expecting a small incremental change where you shouldn't really rock the boat, or do you have the mandate to make some fundamentally like some revamps, let's say? What can and cannot be touched? Regarding assumptions and hypotheses, you should address what assumptions you're making, and hypotheses, what data or information do you have to back this up, and how will you validate those? And then we come to process stages and decisions. Are you currently diverging or converging? How final are decisions? Some PMs might expect linearity in the design process, which is not the reality a lot of the times. It can be a lot less structured, and it's not a perfect pattern of converging and diverging. So it's really important to communicate where you're at and what you're up to, like Carly mentioned. And the last thing is, what does success look like? Do you have any usability metrics that you're going to be using? And just clarifying, keeping an open mind and being honest in your communication can really help. It can also help to have a designer, to keep a prioritized list of to-dos and design debt in general to have on hand and bring up when opportunities present themselves. And that can tackle that friction area of that halfway state that gets released and you don't want to have your really awesome idea forgotten about. Next slide. In general, when disagreements occur, I think it's most helpful to settle disputes by prototyping and getting feedback from users. As a designer, you should be willing to explore multiple solutions before settling, and the PM should be willing to discard previously made assertions in light of new evidence. So in general, open-mindedness is the way to go. It can also be helpful to focus on how to fix and avoid misalignment in the future versus assigning blame. So those are some tips I have for working with a product manager. I am super welcome to any feedback or suggestions that you may have. And if you have any questions, please shoot them my way. Yeah, cool.
I think Brandon is here.
Yeah, but you can go ahead.
Okay.
My internet died, so wasn't able to come on time.
Sure. So, hi everyone, I'm Jack, and today I'll be talking about dev designer collaboration from a dev's perspective. And after me, Brandon will be talking about it more from a designer's perspective. So I'm Jack, and yeah, I recently graduated from Waterloo and I'm currently working as a UX engineer at Expedia. Previously, I worked in several software developer co-op positions, but I also have experience working as a product designer on Blueprint and previously working as a product designer at a startup. Next slide, please. So yeah, I'll be talking about dev designer collaboration. Next slide. So I'll be going through 3 topics for today. First one is understand why design is important for a dev. Second, understand the functional and styling capability of your code. And third, be your designer's best friend and test dummies. Next slide, please. So why good design is important and why you should care as a dev. Next slide. So from my experience, not every engineer care about design the same way. There will be a lot of the engineer may not care as much, and they will be this way because as a full stack software engineer, design is just a small subset of their work that should be completed mostly by the designer. And so the TLDR of kind of like why design matter for a dev is better design leads to better product. Better product will bring more joy and make the user happier, and happier user are much more willing to pay for the service or product that they use. And another thing is good design encompasses great usability. So when you're working at a company, if your product is difficult to use, users will leave. So as a dev, you should still care about that. So next slide, please. And second point is you want to understand the functional and the styling capability of your code. Next slide. So why should devs care? Well, first, if you understand your code base and you master styling, you can understand constraints early. And when you understand constraints early, you'll be able to see like the design mockup, and you know kind of like early on what's possible or not with your code. And then you can communicate that with your designer early so that they can go back and iterate. And it kind of goes back to the second point, which is give feedback to designers early. When you give feedback to designer early, they can iterate fast, make any necessary changes, and then it wouldn't block you on the long run. And another thing is you want to learn how things are usually styled in your organization, because every company is different, from startups to bigger corporation. Everyone does it differently. And you want to understand conventions and tokens. For example, in smaller startups, there tend to be a lot more custom CSS being written, and there might not be, like, for example, theming in the code base. But in larger companies, there usually uses theme and tokens. And then another advice for devs would be take Figma out for a spin and play around with it, so that when you get the design handoff or when you have to view the design in Figma, you know exactly what to do. And also give the design system a read. The designer put a lot of effort into that. Next slide, please. And the last point is try to be your designer's best friend and their user. Next slide. So you want to work on good communication and build trust with your designer. That is also the key to becoming best friend, right? No, but seriously though, when you're not familiar with your designer, you can be much more conservative with what you say and the type of feedback that you give. And when you're close and when you're tight with your designer, you can be much more straightforward with your thoughts, and communication can occur much more frequently. And when you trust your designer, you spend much less time questioning what they're building. You spend much less time questioning what you're building and more time focusing on actually solving the problem. And I want to talk a bit about good versus bad communication. So bad communication is, I'll give you an example, is when you send the designer kind of like a message asking about the design on Monday, and then they get back to you on Friday. That's bad communication, and it really slows the company down a lot. Good communication, what that looks like is you're basically, you go to work in the morning and you're camping by their desk, working closely, showing them your progress, building, iterating fast. And then when you're done, when you two are done working together, you go out for a coffee break. So like what I think, designer and dev communication should be like is fast, frequent, and don't be afraid, to bug each other. And next slide, please. Yeah, I believe this is the older slide deck, so it's missing some slides. But another thing I wanted to talk about is how designers can make the developers' lives easier. First point is you want to communicate early to the developers so that the developer can better understand your constraint and relate it back to their constraint. And when you both are able to achieve this, you're able to spot problems early and work out a solution early. Second point is you want to communicate often. When you're communicating often, you can iterate fast, and you can, and the dev and designer can get into a habit of having a good feedback loop. That is very important to build product fast and efficient. Third point is treat your developer as a user. Don't just treat them as a dev, but treat them as a user. Treat this as an early opportunity to test your idea, to test your design, to test your prototype, to see if what you think will work actually work. And the last point is understand your dev's design knowledge. So when you understand kind of like the knowledge, the design knowledge that your dev have, you can better and more effectively communicate with them. So for example, there might be times when you have to explain certain jargon, certain idea, theories, and principles of design to your dev if they're not that comfortable or that into design. And another thing is show them any design doc or related readings that you think will help them speed up, or that will help them, that will help your collaboration become more efficient. And yeah, that is all. Thank you.
Nice. Okay, now that Brandon is back, I'm gonna just go back to his section. Here we go. Okay. Brandon, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Carmen. Awesome stuff, Jack. Yeah, just an introduction to myself. I'm Brandon. I'm class of 2020 computer science, so I graduated last year. And currently I'm a product designer at Influitive. We're a 120-person startup creating a white label SaaS product, so software as a service for building customer community and advocacy. Currently our team is 3 designers, and we're working with approximately 40 devs. So that gives you a little bit of sense of how important it is to work efficiently with our devs as designers. And in the past, I've finished 4 internships as a developer, both in Android and full stack. Eventually, I switched to design, but that kind of gives me an idea of what devs need, but also what design needs, vice versa. Next slide, I guess. So, the first question, why should you care? Like, why don't I just create designs and then give it to devs? Well, you don't want to spend time wasting time and effort on solutions that are really impossible to build. At the end of the day, that's all that really matters, is if your solution can't be developed, there's no point in designing it because you're just going to be wasting everyone's time. So keeping that in mind. Also, if you want resources for design, for example, if you want user testing tools, or if you want another designer, if you want people to take the things that you say seriously, then you need to get buy-in from everyone, and that includes developers. So being able to communicate effectively and also convince people that your designs work and are successful. You have to do that in order to get that buy-in and get those resources, because no one's going to give it to you until you show that your skills are valid. And the third point is your designs are only as good as how it's implemented. Well, if you make the most perfect designs and you make the most perfect mockups, everything's pixel perfect, everything's amazing, and you give it to a dev and they can't really implement it for you and they can't implement it well, then you want on the flip side, the quality of it won't be as good, and you won't get what you want. Next slide, please. So one of the first things that really helps with developing your solutions and working with devs is keeping in mind that passion inspires quality, and that the product that you're working on is just as much the developers as it is yours. Although we spend most of the time, most of our day, staring at the product, trying to find ways to make it better. And it may seem that we put the most work into it. It's not that case in the end. Ownership provides you that sense of control and pride that you can really use to inspire developers to spend that extra time and effort in making the product look and feel amazing. Like, if you can provide the developers with ownership, they feel like they have control over it and that their efforts aren't going nowhere, then they will spend the extra time to make it look that bit more better. And the third point, you really want to involve developers in key decision making, and then aim to create consensus with their voice heard instead of just treating them as like a code monkey. It might be a bit counterintuitive, but being able to provide developers with the ability to speak their mind and make those decisions really helps them feel in the loop and well communicated with. And then, so these things are some examples that you could do to inspire passion with them. Next slide. Something else to keep in mind is that developers are also your users. The designs that you create, when you spec them out, when you prepare for handoff, whatever you share with your developers, they're going to be using your designs. So trying to keep in mind that when you document things, document in a way that works for them. So some different elements that you want to keep in mind of is form, detailed delivery, and support. So the first one is form. So what format of documentation or design will your developers like the best? Do they like user flows or task flows? Or do we prefer like static images with annotations, prototypes, or text? It really changes a lot. Personally, in my work, like it really depends on the situation of the project, what devs you're working with. Some might like staring at or playing around with prototypes. Some might prefer just text only, just telling them what to do. Some like static images, and then you just kind of write down documentation explaining it. It really just is subjective. So just keeping that in mind. The second point is detail. So, what level of visual or text documentation is needed. Sometimes they want more text explanation. Sometimes they want more visuals. Again, very subjective. And the third one, delivery. What channels should you be sharing these specs with or through? Should you be using your communication software, Slack, Teams, etc., or productivity software, Jira, Asana, Trello, or maybe you're living in the 90s and you like email, but I digress, whatever. And then the fourth one, support. What type of support does your developers need after the fact? It's not the end of the day. You just want to hand it off and just let it go and not worry about it anymore. You have to see it to the end. There's not really any end of the line for projects. You kind of always have to look at it. What are success metrics? How can you improve it after the fact, after it's developed? So that also goes for how it's implemented. So being able to support developers through it. Sometimes they'll have questions. Sometimes you need to clarify things. Maybe your documentation isn't good enough, and you'll have to support that. Some people like pairing sessions, maybe like sitting down with the developers and you guys work it out beside each other, or they prefer like periodic checkups, maybe once a week, or it's just like ad hoc touch points. So here and there, if they need help, they'll reach out to you as needed. Next slide. So something to keep in mind, I think a lot of people, when you first become a designer, even if you're in design for quite a few number of years, the biggest thing is communication and being able to sell your designs. I think a lot of people talk about this. And the same goes for when you're talking to developers, being able to get them to trust your designs and not question what they're building every step of the way. And a big part of that is transparency. Developers and they are very logic driven and very rational. But I am that way as well. Like that's how I was and still am these days. And really, when it comes to it, the more evidence you give them that your design decisions are correct, the more they will respect it. Same goes for leadership, management, others who aren't in design. As long as you show evidence and real data that backs it, they will believe it and try to do that as much as possible. And we have to keep in mind that design isn't just making things pretty or just making good decisions. Sometimes it might feel like that after a while. You get that like sense of intuition and gut reflex that certain things look right or feel right, things like that. But keeping in mind that you have to show that rigor that goes into creating designs by involving developers in things like user tests, interviews, ideation sessions, design reviews. The more transparency you give, the more evidence will be shown, and that's really, really helpful. So if you have that ability if the developers have that time, grab a developer in your team, bring them onto a user test or an interview, or during your weekly design review with the design team, invite a few developers and have them view, into the inner workings of what goes behind all the designs, and it's not just you coming up with things. Next slide. So a shared language, still building off that communication point, getting that shared language is really important. At the end of the day, like designers, we speak in our own language, design systems, components, task flows, user flows, what do all these terms mean. Developers won't really know either. And on the other side, developer has their own jargon, like APIs, front end versus back end, any framework, Kubernetes, Docker, Rails, etc., props, asynchronous programming, object-oriented programming. Like designers have no idea what that means. At the end of the day, like it's very different worlds. So on both sides, if you're a designer, learning at least a little bit of the developer world, so HTML, CSS, JavaScript, just the really basics of it, how things are built, get a sense of that scale of complexity. So how many hours does it take to build a button versus how many hours is it to build a table, things like that, to get an understanding of what you can change in your design to either reduce or increase complexity. And that really helps when it comes to designing pragmatically and trying to design for the developers and for the users, trying to reach that compromise between the two. And then when it comes to projects itself, just being able to clarify terminology early. Sometimes there are jargons, things like components. It might mean two different things on the design side and development side. So just speaking on that early and landing on something that both parties agree on. Next slide. Oh, it's missing a slide. But oh yeah, this one. Never mind. So this is like the biggest point. If you're gonna take away anything, take away this. Make compromise. Like, don't have an ego. What you design isn't always the best thing in the world. It might feel like that sometimes, but it's not. Devs, they will have points. They will raise points about their designs that might make sense. Like maybe that's something that you didn't think of. And at the same time, you will have that knowledge from the user that you know that your design is correct. I'm doing this for a certain reason. I can't take this away. So being able to get to the bottom of what your developers want. This goes for any stakeholder. So if it comes to a PM or your CEO or developers or CSMs, architects, things like that, talking to them, getting to the bottom of what they want, and creating a solution that works for all parties. So know what your big value drivers are, what the big things that your users want, what the big things that your developers want, and then reaching a consensus and reaching a compromise that will get everyone what they want in the end of the day. And that's really the best thing you can do. Making it easy to work with you, also trying to reach a solution that works and that is effective at the end of the day. I know that when you're working on designs, you spend hours and hours and hours trying to create a solution and ideate and come to a conclusion on what solution is the best. And it might feel really bad when PMs come in, developers come in and say, you can't do this, you can't do that. And it kind of gets dwindled down into an MVP and a really small subset of the features that you want. But that's, although a bad situation, you can still make the best out of it. Although you might have fewer features, you could spend that extra time on increasing the quality of each of those smaller features, or each of the features, and things like animation states, designing for responsive transitions, copy, working on all those things can provide you with that richer experience at the end. So a quick recap. Involve your developers when making key decisions. So taking them into design practices and design ceremonies. Second, prepare design specs that accommodate your developers' preferences. That's just down to communication. Third, invite developers to design ceremonies to create transparency, which is similar to the first point. Fourth, clarify product terminology and avoid domain-specific jargon. So avoid your design jargon or your developer jargon, depending on what party you're on. And then fifth, make compromise and do more with less. And yeah, if you have any questions, message me. But yeah, that's it.
Nice. Thanks, Brandon. So now I guess we'll leave the next 5 to 10 minutes for any questions anyone might have. If you feel comfortable, feel free to unmute. If not, you can just type it in the message. Sorry, type it in the chat box and we'll read it out. Except I don't know how to open the chat box from here. Oh, here we go.
It's okay. If there's anything in the chat, I can read it out. But currently, it seems like there's no questions.
Oh yeah, I have a question, Carmen. I forgot if you said we could talk out loud, but
Yeah, go for it.
Okay,
Go
awesome.
ahead, Flora.
So, when you're working on a smaller team, when say you're the sole advocate for design, how do you stand up for your ideas when in stand-ups, and how do you advocate for the user when the whole team is being introduced to design?
Yeah, I can answer that. So I feel like if I think back to the very beginnings of being on this team, I spent a lot of time trying to get people excited about design. And so with every project, before I would jump into doing the project work, or I would do a kickoff meeting, I would first put together something to like explain why it was important or why it was exciting. So I remember a couple months in, I led like a redesign of our brand. And so before I like embarked on that work and before I brought people into like ideation and like different workshop-y type things we did to narrow our brand image and like brand intent, I took like the first 20 minutes of the meeting to be like, this is why brand design's freaking awesome. And these are like all the super cool things we can do. And I brought the team through this exercise where we like looked at 4 different banks and how their branding was different and like what their inherent like assumptions were about the different banks. And then I would like be like, oh, well, what do we notice is the difference, and like connect how the design was like the brand design was translating to their impression of the bank. And so it was kind of fun because I think my team was like, when you're a small team, I feel like it's easier to get the team in a meeting. It's not as like scary to have like the whole team together. And so from that, I think it was like a lot easier to get people educated and like excited about some of the nuances of design. And since once we had that like baseline terminology, it was a lot easier to keep people in the loop about like the brand decisions I was making along the way. And like for them to weigh in on colors even, because I feel like a trope of like product design feedback from non-designers is like, oh, can you make the button orange instead? But after like all these kind of conversations about why the like differences and nuances of what we chose for our brand, how that was like influential in the overall brand strategy, it made it a lot easier to like explain reasoning behind those different decisions. And there was like a lot less pushback than I anticipated. And I think that was like in part because of that upfront.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks a lot, Carly.
I think another thing to add on to that is data. A lot of people like data and numbers. So if you are trying to explain something, if you have data, like if you did an A/B test and you're like, hey, this is our existing design, and then here's what I want to change, and this new change increases conversion by X%, then people usually are like, well, can't argue with that. So if you have data, it's always an easy one to fall back on and to help.
+1.
Yeah, it's a good thing to help stand your ground. We have a question in the chat, which I think Jack answered in a chat. Well, actually, Jack, you might have to copy and paste that because you sent that in a direct message. But Vicky asks, do you think this field is limited by your degree, i.e. could a student in biology pursue this career? And Jack says, of course, he has a degree in biotechnology and he does design and development. If no one else wants to take this answer, I can answer this really quickly. No, it helps if you have a degree in this because you have the education in it. But there's plenty of boot camps and resources out there. It's not impossible to learn by yourself, but it just might be a little bit harder and takes a little bit more initiative on your part.
Yeah, I'd double that. I'd say no. I mean, it matters to a degree when it comes to like the earlier roles. Getting your foot in the door, it gets harder. But you can really counteract that by being proactive. And sometimes you have to volunteer for roles, like things like Blueprint provide a great opportunity to kind of build up your toolkit. Like we've done some hiring over the last year, and I've noticed that I rarely even care about your degree. Most of the time we just look at your portfolio, we look at what work you've done, your, not to be stereotypical, but looking at your process, looking at like your data, looking at how you go about your design, and just being able to learn that and applying that to your roles early on is like a great booster in terms of how employable you are. So yeah, I just say no, just put in the effort and be proactive in terms of finding opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Can I add?
I realized my answer was a bit confusing. I didn't realize it was a two-part question, but yeah, your degree doesn't matter. And yeah, of course you can pursue this field with a biology degree. Yeah.
Carly, did you have a comment?
Oh, yes. +1 to these things. And then one thing is, I feel like it's helpful if you can still try to find and like craft a narrative so that people can understand how you got from your degree, which you chose, to then choosing design. So I feel like being able to like concisely connect those dots makes it a lot easier to like understand who you are as a candidate too. And that doesn't necessarily like, I feel like whatever is truthful in that, like it doesn't have to be like a one-to-one match, but like being able to still share the story of how you got from your degree selection to your interest in product design is helpful.
Plus one to that, I think a lot of the earlier internships I got in tech was by telling stories of why I went from biotech to, you know, getting curious into tech, software, and product, and, you know, just my story. Yeah.
It actually works in your favor if you're smart in terms of storytelling it. You can give many reasons, and if you can show your passion for design and tell them a good reason why you came into design, then it can add to your, you know, to your personality as a candidate.
Yeah, and story really helps you during the interview because it's not something you fit or putting on your resume, right? I always give this suggestion to people for interview is your interviewer picked you for a reason based on your resume or based on your portfolio. If you can, you know, meet their expectation, that is good. But, you know, during the interview, if you can do something or say something that exceed their expectation, that's when you walk away from that interview knowing, oh shoot, I might get this job.
Yeah, your degree is probably one of the smaller parts of your application. There's a lot of other bigger parts to it.
All right. We have another question from Jay, and the question is, what are some roles that integrate both design and development? Currently, I have interest in both, and I don't know which one to pursue. So I'm gonna toss that over to Brandon and Jack, who have done both. And I think Jack is literally a UX engineer. If you guys want to take that question.
Yeah, UX engineer is a really good role. When I first started in design, I was a dev, like full-on dev. Didn't have any role in design. I mean, I guess I was a front-end developer because I was working on Android, but just trying to get knowledge in design, you know, showing that you're interested, talk to your design team if you're working with one, or if you have one on your company. Join in on their design meetings, design reviews. It's a big one, just learning like the fundamentals of design, why certain designs are good, why certain designs are bad, learn about the principles, the laws that we follow, and see if you like it. Sometimes you can also join in on user testing. As I said earlier, like designers, you know, we always need a second hand in terms of testing. We need a note taker, or we need someone to kind of get like a second eye on things. So, you know, put yourself out there, ask your designers to see if there's any opportunity for you to learn, and then see where that goes. You know, maybe they have a design role that opens up in terms of an internship, and they can take you on. So yeah, just showing your interest and being open to learning.
Yeah, and I think another like good opportunity to, if you're still unsure about which one you want to do, I feel like working or interning at a startup is like a really good opportunity to kind of do both, because you're kind of expected to wear a lot of hats and you will have a lot of opportunities to step up and take on different types of roles. And yeah, I know that's what Vanessa did at an internship, and she did both design and like development. So something to consider and look into.
Yeah, I think if you're interested in both design and dev, UX engineering is probably the way to go. But I do want to warn though, like, because it's still quite, like I say, like a relatively new role and kind of like a field. So every company, every startup's definition of UX engineer is different. So I think like probably like the best definition is the one given by Google. But after talking to like several UX engineers from different companies, the lines between a front-end engineer and a UX engineer may blur a little. So that's something I think you definitely want to ask during an interview or check out when reading like a job description. But I do want to say, you know, what will really help you is try to become like a designer who knows how to code, or try to become a front-end engineer who really loves and do design on the side. And that will really help you in the long run.
Cool.
I want to make a quick side note about not knowing which one you want to pursue, like you don't have to worry about like if you choose design or development that you're locked into it. So it's not a big deal if you choose to explore one. You can always try the other one at a later time. Like you're young, you have time to try all these different paths. So don't feel like you have to make that decision now.
I have a quick question. So like, what does an interview look like for a design role? Like what type of questions do they usually ask there?
Does UWUX want to take this question?
Yeah, so we're a bit tight on time, but we actually have an article that we wrote on this topic. If Vanessa is free, I think she can drop it in the chat. Yeah, sorry to cut you off, but we're just going over, so I think we'll move on if no one else has anything else. But we do have a Medium article on this.
Yeah, if you guys have any more questions, feel free to reach out to any of the speakers that spoke today, as well as join the UWX community. There's definitely a lot of other designers in that space that are happy to answer any of your questions. But we do have one quick announcement to make before everyone drops off. Carmen, do you have a slide? Okay, so UW Blueprint is currently recruiting for our fall term. So if you want to join this club of really amazing and awesome people, you guys can check out our application on our website, which if Vanessa, if you could link it again, that would be great. Our applications will be open until July 17th, if I recall correctly. If you have any questions about applying to Blueprint, you can ask any of the Blueprint kids here on this presentation. So me, Carmen, or Jenna, I think we're mostly the active members. Everyone else has graduated, so I don't want to bug them too much about this. But yes, please apply. Oh, if you want to bug Grace, you guys can bug Grace. She just dropped an XD in the chat. She's graduated, but she's still around. But yeah, it's on our website. Yeah, but come join us if you want to learn design, or we also have other positions. It's not just design. We also have spots for development, maybe PM, Jenna, and other like
PM.
Probably a PM. Yeah, so we got quite a few roles open. There's also some, if any of these tech roles are not a fit for you, we also have some other e-team roles that you can, so you can still contribute to the club in other ways if you don't feel like designing or coding or PMing.
Yeah.
Cool. So from the UWUX side, we have a couple events coming this term. So firstly, we have Pathways to User Experience Research on July 21st. We have some cool panelists coming up. More info coming. Secondly, we have Indent 2.0 happening on July 29th, and that will be a panel on DEI, diversity, equity, equality, and inclusion, and accessibility. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Apologies for running 4 minutes over time, but if you would like to stick around to ask more questions, I'm happy to stick around, and hopefully some other presenters will be as well. But yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Feel free to email either organizations if you have any other questions. Yeah,